People who have heard deathbed confessions, what were some interesting ones? My grandma confessed to murder on her deathbed. Usually you'd think it was the pain relief, but she was such an eccentric it was actually believable. We traced all her ex-husbands, partners and any other likely candidates, and fortunately no one was missing or died an untimely death, but sometimes I wonder. My dad had Alzheimer's and ended up in a secure ward. He was blind and almost deaf. I was visiting him one day. He didn't know who I was, but he started talking about me. He said I had done better than him in life and that he was proud of me. He was a quiet man IRL and never told me that when I was growing up. Looking back, he did things that my dumb ass never realized were for me. Like, when he retired his colleagues asked what he'd like as a present, he chose a scientific calculator. This was back in the 1970s. He had no use for it. He gave it to me for university. I thought he was just passing it on, not realizing that he'd asked for it with me in mind. I don't know if this counts as a confession, but it felt like one. My grandparents have 3 daughters. Everyone always said that my mom was my grandfather's secret favorite. He never agreed. I heard he was on his deathbed on April 6th, went to see him on April 8th. He was scary looking and the doctor kept saying he didn't understand why he wasn't dead yet. April 9th, everyone but my mom had the chance to come and say goodbye. She doesn't drive and my dad works 10 hours away. My grandpa kept saying her name, well, saying. He couldn't eat or drink, so it was more like a whisper. My mom came by on the 10th. He looked at her, smiled, whispered my Amy. He closed his eyes and never opened them again. The exact thing happened with my grandpa. He was in an almost comatose state and survived 2 weeks past where the doctors, hospice nurse said should have been possible. His oldest son hasn't been able to come see him because he lives out of state and his wife was getting a serious surgery that was life or death and couldn't be postponed. Finally he was able to fly down to see Grandpa one last time, spend a few hours with him, and then Grandpa passed. Death is so strange. My grandma suffered from dementia for many years before she passed. It got so bad she didn't remember who her family were, and would barricade herself in her home because she was scared of everyone. She even forgot she smoked and would find her cigarettes months later after forgetting where they were and claim she was desperate for one. She'd put them away after one and that would be her again for months. The only memories she had left at the end was that her sister used to be able to play the piano beautifully and her husband, her childhood sweetheart, was gone but she didn't know where. He died some time earlier. She spent her days waiting for him to come home from wherever he was. My John will be home soon, she would say, or someone would walk past the window and she'd double take and say thought that was my John. It was heartbreaking watching her deteriorate until she was on her deathbed, unaware of anything or anyone. I went to say my goodbyes to her in the hospital and she held my hand and told me how much she loved me but how she was ready to go be with John now. In that moment, she remembered who I was, what was happening to her and that her husband, my granddad, had gone already. She went in her sleep not long after that, and I'm forever thankful I managed to say goodbye and tell her how much I loved her too. I've held on to that moment for so long without really digesting it in any way that writing this just wore my heart out. I miss them both so much but I know they're finally together again somewhere. I have an amazing one. My great-grandmother lived a very long and interesting life. She was in her 20s in the Great Depression. She had a wild streak from those days that we don't know much about, to the point that we actually don't know our great-grandfather's name, just the husband she took later. Over the course of her nearly 100-year life, she had collected owls, literally thousands of owl figurines. She had clocks, wall hangings, pot holders, lamps, stained glass art, salt shakers, and more little figurines than you could imagine, all depicting owls. We all wondered the importance of the owls. She never talked about them. We just all knew she loved owls. Well, when she was nearing death, at the age of 98 or 99, and the docs said she had days, my grandparents went and talked to her and they asked her if she had anything she wanted to share or ask before she goes. She thought for a moment, then said, "I never understood the owls." It turns out, she didn't really give a shit about owls. Near as we could piece together, sometime in the 40s or 50s perhaps, she bought either a trivet or a set of salt, pepper shakers that were owls. Then someone got her the other. Those were the oldest owls anyone could remember. But from there, someone got her an owl to match, probably a potholder or placemat, and all of a sudden her kitchen was owl-themed. From there, it snowballed. The owls flowed like wine, baffling her for 60 years, eventually taking over as the bulk of her personal belongings. The moral is, if you're not actually into something, mention it early. Not my story but that of a hospice worker who spoke to my class. For those who don't know, hospice is a method of end-of-life care that focuses on alleviating the emotional and physical pain of a dying person to ease their passing rather than combating their imminent death. One of her patients was a bed-bound woman in her 90s who was generally unresponsive but had flashes of recognition and engagement. It's hard to gauge the level to which unresponsive patients are detached from their surroundings, so they encourage family members to keep their company in hopes of soothing the patient. Now this patient was from a U.S. state that prided itself on its state university, and the university's football team. The woman's family had attended this university for 4 or 5 generations during her hospice care. However, her great-granddaughter was the first in their family to decide to go to a different school, the rival state's university. In fact, her family was supportive of her decision but often joked about her being the rebel or Judas or what have you. One day, they were all sitting around the woman's bedside, teasing the girl about her decision. Suddenly, the patient sat up, looked at her great-granddaughter, said, "Traitor," and fucking died. Edit. Wow. Thank you for all the awards. I'm glad you all enjoyed the story. I heard it 4 years ago and I still think and laugh about it often. The hospice worker said that the family thought it was hilarious. This isn't a confession, but I just wanted to share the last thing my grandfather said to me before he passed away due to lung cancer. I was about to go to Rome for a school trip and my family told me to go to set my mind on something else for a few days. Before I left, I wanted to say goodbye as it was possibly the last time I could talk to him. He told me, "Have fun, boy. I'll see you next week." I went to Rome and when I came back, he was already in a deep sleep due to medication. He wanted to peacefully pass away while sleeping. I came back the next week and he was sleeping when I went to visit him. I told him everything I did in Rome even though I knew he wouldn't wake up. The next morning he passed away. My grandmother said to me, "He waited for you." I still miss him so much. My grandfather, who had not been a religious man throughout his life, stated on the second to last day he was alive that in the prior few nights he was seeing beings in the bedroom with him. He could not discern what they were but one in particular made him very fearful. My dad has a special ability to gain people's trust, in a good way. Twice now he's had instances where dying people tell him things that they feel they can't tell their family. The one case was when my aunt's mother-in-law was dying. She explained to my dad that her husband cannot live alone and that they both agree he must find a new partner after she passes. He did. He remarried within a year of her passing. At the age of 81, the family was very upset about him moving on so fast. My dad had to stand up for him and reassure them that it is what his late wife wanted. My time to shine. I worked at a hospital in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, a small town near Munich, for the last 14 years. My job there is not fancy at all. I move people around, throw the trash out, and occasionally I take care of some handy-like work, fix a leaking shower head and stuff like that. As you can imagine, I get to see a lot of patients that come and go. Some of them pass away, such is life, I guess. I remember a few instances of people confessing to me their biggest regrets. Here are some examples. An old Polish woman told me that she regretted not fucking Hitler when she had the chance. Her words: "I wanted to ask her about more context, but I was afraid to be honest." Another notable example was an old truck driver that used to work for an Eastern Germany company. He told me that he once ran over some kids with his truck and was too afraid to stop and check if they were okay. Once another Polish lady told me that she used to be a prostitute during Second World War and that she slept with very high-up people in the government. She told me that she did not regret that part of her life, but that she could not tell anyone, and that was a heavy emotional drag. She also told me that she aborted more than 5 babies during that time. When I was in hospital, the guy in the bed next to me just asked to stop taking his meds as he was ready to die. Last thing I heard him say was, "There's no one waiting for me at home, so I'm going where they are." Wasn't really a shocking confession, just a lonely and heartbreaking one. A couple of days before my grandmother passed away, she was really confused and was talking about my mother having a child a year or so after my own birth that was sent for adoption. She was talking about how sad and horrible this was and that I deserved to know. After my grandmother passed, I confronted my mom about it and she neglected this, and I truly believed her. Couple of months later, it turns out my grandmother was the one adopting away a baby girl who was born between my mother and aunt. My grandfather had pretty terrible dementia and he kept making deathbed confessions as he knew he didn't have much time left. They were often about witnessing a murder and not telling anyone, but each time he confessed to us the details changed. It happened a couple of times a day over the course of his final week. We finally figured out that he would watch the local news and hear about these things happening, then would think he had actually witnessed them. We had a similar situation in our extended family. Alzheimer's made this family member insanely paranoid. He thought that people were constantly trying to break into his home and murder him. Turns out his wife was watching lots of crime shows around him and he could no longer distinguish reality from fiction. I didn't see it, but my aunt watched her elderly mother fall down the stairs and confessed just before she died that she wasn't her biological mother. She told my aunt that her oldest sister was actually her mother. The sister had gotten pregnant too young and the mom said it was hers, a common way of handling it back then. She revealed it in her very last breath. My great-uncle actually confessed to having 2 illegitimate sons right before he kicked the bucket in front of his own children and grandchildren. The crazy thing was that none of his children knew this life of his. Not even my great-aunt knew about it because she would have made a huge fuss if she was alive at that time and knew about it. What was crazier was that these 2 sons already passed away 5 and 7 years ahead of him respectively. He was 98 years old and his invisible sons were 65 and 69 years old. The children found out that one of his invisible sons actually was a teacher at a school that his granddaughters attended when they were in high school. Nevertheless, his children decided to reach out to the children of his invisible sons. They got connected and learned more stuff about my granduncle. The craziest thing was that I actually dated one of the granddaughters of one of the invisible sons. The one passed away at the age of 69 years old. Talking about a few degrees of separation, I helped care for my dad as he died from cancer earlier this year. He would get agitated and reach his arms out and try to sit up. The last thing he said was "Fuya ugh." Not sure what it was referencing, pain, drugs, or war memories, but that stuck with me. He passed very peacefully in the end. Not a deathbed confession exactly. I was a hospice volunteer and worked with a man with a brain tumor. He was in pretty shape except for that. He was going nuts in the nursing home, and one day I took him for a ride around town. He had grown up there. Seemed like every other block he would point at an old building and say used to be a whorehouse there. Empty lot. Used to be a building there and it had a pretty good whorehouse there. There was a whore there until it burned down. We passed by this old odd-looking apartment building that had more doors than it should have, and it appeared some of them were sealed up. He said that used to be a crib and each door had a small room behind it and each whore had her own room. We passed under a railroad bridge and he pointed a flat area, and there used to be black women that ran the best whorehouse in the state right there. I finally laughed her and said, "Guess I know what you spent your youth doing." Not a deathbed confession, but the last conversation I had with my grandfather has always stuck with me. He had Parkinson's and lived on a farm outside of town. One day he looked at me and said, "I'm getting too old to take care of Mom, my grandmother. I need you to do that for me, okay?" His health deteriorated pretty rapidly from that point onward. I still call my grandmother every single day, and try to get back home whenever I can to help out around the farm. My great-grandfather was in his mid-90s when he died. Health was always good, but a benign tumor deemed too dangerous to operate on at his age went septic. He was dead a week later. I went to visit him in the hospital. My family used to see him a lot, but there was a falling out between him and my grandma several years before, so we stopped seeing them. Funny enough though, I constantly ran into him at the store and we always had nice chats. Anyway, in the hospital he told me not to worry about him. Most everyone he's ever known was dead, and he was ready to die. The week he felt himself getting sick, he knew something was off and made arrangements to get my great-grandma into a nursing home. He took care of her with her Alzheimer's, so he wouldn't die until he knew she was taken care of. They were married for over 70 years. My favorite story is that every Sunday for over 50 years, he would drop my great-grandma off at church, and then sat in the car and waited for her. Hated religion, but loved his wife lol. Not exactly on his deathbed. My stepfather emailed me the night he passed away. In general, he was always in pain from chemo, cancer, meds and whatnot. He did not want to continue spending money as he wasted away. He asked me to never tell the rest of the family, but I'm taking all my sleeping pills tonight after your mom goes to bed. With luck, she'll never know the truth. It would break her. I didn't witness this personally as it was between my grandfather and his father. My great-grandfather was not a nice man. He beat his children. One time he beat his daughter with a table leg, and I am assuming did the same to his wife. Anyway, she left him and the kids behind. This was the 30s and I am assuming that he didn't allow her to take the kids with her, and it's not like women's rights were great back then. My grandfather left home at 8 years old and fended for himself for his entire life. On his deathbed, nasty grandpa told the boys that he had a bunch of money stashed on the old property, and if they went to see him, he would tell them where it was. No one went. Edit for clarity. Nasty grandpa was my great-grandfather. Nothing dark, but unexpected for me. I spent a lot of time with my 90-something-year-old grandfather in his final months. He was married to my grandmother for over 70 years and told me he never slept with any other woman. This was followed by him asking me what it was like to sleep with more than one person in your lifetime. He, partially paralyzed from a stroke, at the end of his life, also told me, as he was waking up from a nap, that he was just dreaming about having sex with Betty Grable. I never shared these details with my family. Mother ran a nursing home growing up. From ages 5 to 10 I spent every weekend with residents. Because I was a kid, residents often confessed stuff they thought I wouldn't understand. Two stick out. One funny, one not. Woman was dying, maybe about 96, even had her last burst of energy. life where she thought she was better. This is common. A black delivery man came with some flowers. After he left, she looked at me with tears in her eyes and said, "I can't believe I'm dying without having been with a colored man." Second one was while I was reading Bible verses to a resident. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to drop that baby in the well."